Welcome to the Spurgeon Legacy Podcast. Each week, we'll explore Spurgeon's enduring ministry through unabridged audio sermons delivered with the dynamic of live preaching, essays, articles, devotionals, selections from Spurgeon's writings, as well as interviews with authors, biographers, and Spurgeon scholars. On this episode, we'll get to hear from Alex DiPrima, pastor of Emanuel Church in Winston Salem, North Carolina. Pastor Alex has a new book out titled Spurgeon, A Life, a biography of the Prince of Preachers. In our conversation, we'll discuss why there is a need for a new biography of Spurgeon, important events and aspects of his life and ministry, why he is rightly called the Prince of Preachers, and the reason his legacy continues to this day. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Alex DiPrima. Well, all right, Pastor Alex, thanks for joining me for this conversation about Charles Haddon Spurgeon.
Clay, it's a joy to be on. I appreciate the invite and always happy to talk about Spurgeon.
Absolutely. So could you just introduce yourself a bit and what your ministry looks like?
Sure. Alex DiPrima, my wife Jenna, we have 3 kids together, and God has blessed us with a happy and healthy family. And we live in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where I pastor Emanuel Church of Winston-Salem. We planted the church about 7 years ago. And these have been some of the best years of our lives. It was the first church I've pastored. I was sent out from another church about an hour east of where we are, and grateful for the ministry God has given us here. I preach the word most Sundays, helps lead our eldership, and involved in discipling members, counseling, all the basic things pastors do. And grateful for the ministry God's given to us, the church family God's given to us. Originally, I grew up in South Florida, and then I was in South Carolina, end of high school, went to Clemson University for undergrad, then on up to the Raleigh-Durham area for seminary training at Southeastern Seminary. Eventually did my PhD there in Spurgeon studies. I did that while we began to plant the church in Winston-Salem 8 years ago, and finished that up eventually. And so my main work is pastoring, but I do have the joy of kind of on the side as a hobby and research interests, and I guess I could call it a ministry. It's just writing books, and I do that as much as I have time to do it and energy to do it. And so given what my background academically, there's been a special emphasis in my writing on Spurgeon up till now, and that's where this biography came from, and that's what I've been busy with.
Wonderful. Now, obviously, you had that background in your studies of focusing on Spurgeon, but where did that come from? Like, can you
Sure.
recall your first exposure to Spurgeon and what really kind of hooked your interest?
Yeah, well, I grew up in South Florida in a church that was a Reformed Baptist church of the best kind. It was a church that held to the Second London Baptist Confession of 1689. It was a very Spurgeonic church. I think it's a church that Spurgeon would have approved of, have been encouraged by. And it was what I say it was a kind of a Spurgeon type Reformed Baptist church. It was a church that loved the confession, was Calvinistic for sure, and loved the Reformers and the Reformed tradition. Was also warmly evangelical, Christ-centered ministry, preaching that was full of Jesus and full of the cross. And so Spurgeon was frequently quoted by my pastors, one of whom was an Englishman himself. And we had Banner of Truth books in the bookstore. The Forgotten Spurgeon, I remember seeing that around, and Spurgeon's Autobiography and the Treasury of David, and those books were kind of in the background. I tell folks it was kind of like as a kid, um, you hear your parents' music played in the house, and then when you're like 16 or 17, you're like, oh, Led Zeppelin's actually really cool. I'm going to listen to Led Zeppelin. I'm going to listen to Dad's albums. That happened with me with Spurgeon. That many people in my orbit loved him. I was aware of him. I knew something about his biography, and then it was around end of high school into college that I began to read him for myself. I got a set of his sermons, and then read other books by him, lectures to my students. I read at 17 or 18 years old as I was aspiring to pastoral ministry. That was a very formative book for me, and began to just fall in love with what I found in Spurgeon. And eventually was invited to do doctoral studies by my eventual doctoral supervisor, Nathan Finn. And by then, it was pretty clear to me if I could study someone on the doctoral level, Spurgeon was going to be the guy.
So was your earliest kind of exposure in terms of, okay, I'm going to look into this a little bit more. Were you reading sermons or were you reading some Spurgeon books? Do you recall what that looked like?
Sermons and biographies largely, and eventually
Sure.
got into secondary literature. But I became very familiar with his basic biography and began to read lots of his preaching. And I had just assumed that Spurgeon had been the subject of lots of doctoral studies and lots of academic interest. But what I discovered when I first floated the idea to Dr. Finn was that he had not. On the doctoral level, there have been more dissertations written of Spurgeon in the last 20 years than there have been in the last 120 years. There was not a lot of academic interest in Spurgeon. I think the reason for that is he's a popular preacher. He's
Yeah.
not a theologian in sort of the capital T sense. He was a pastor theologian, but he didn't go to university. He didn't make major contributions. He didn't write a systematic theology or something like that. So it seems, I don't know if this is true, but my sense is people are eager to study, kind of signal theological contributors like John Owen or Jonathan Edwards or John Calvin, lots of Johns, I guess, Martin Luther. But preachers aren't as interesting to scholars, and so which I think is a shame. Spurgeon's influence is so massive. I think having more
Yeah.
scholarly attention given to Spurgeon is really important, and we're learning all kinds of things we didn't learn before. But what that meant for me, as someone who wanted to study Spurgeon and spend a lot of time studying him, was that I could write on almost anything I wanted to write about, which was, I mean, that was amazing to me. And so I tell folks you could do a lot worse than spend 5 years reading Spurgeon sermons every day. And,
Yeah.
it was a wonderfully edifying study. And someone big enough and has a massive enough corpus, I don't know that I could ever read all that he's written,
Right.
but he can occupy my attention for a lifetime, and I'd still be
Yeah.
finding new things.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable the challenge it would be just to read everything he wrote and the fact that
Yeah.
he wrote what he wrote.
Yeah. Well, he published more words in English than any Christian ever.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
I try to read as much as I can, but I mean, you're looking at 70 volumes of sermons now, and they're thick. They're all about 600, 700 pages. So there's a
Yeah,
lot there.
it's quite
Yeah.
the undertaking. And now you've added to folks' shelves who are interested in Spurgeon. You've had a previous book on his relation to the poor, particularly the
Hmm.
poor of London, and now you've got
Hmm.
a new biography on
Hmm.
Spurgeon, Spurgeon a Life. So, what was it that you saw in the landscape that you thought, yeah, there is a need for a new biography? Because there's a bunch of them. There's a lot of
Yeah,
biographies
sure.
about Spurgeon. What did you see that was maybe lacking that you thought, there's an opportunity here for what I'm going to work on?
Yeah. So I hope this doesn't sound kind of snooty, but though there are a lot of biographies, not there aren't a lot of good ones. Lots of them, many of them were written just within the first year or two after he died. Which there's nothing wrong with that, but a lot of them lack kind of critical distance. A lot of times
Yeah.
the best things you're kind of still assessing a man's legacy in life in the years following his death, and so, some of those early tombstone biographies, as we might call them, um, they're mixed in terms of their quality, and then, there haven't been many biographies written by people who actually have an education in Spurgeon studies. A lot of them are by people who knew Spurgeon, so there are a lot of warm reminiscences, but not a lot of historical analysis. Um, but that said, in the 20th century, there were some very good biographies. One was by W.I. Fullerton, but that's not in print anymore. That's a good biography. J.C. Carlyle wrote one that was very good. Again, not in print anymore, and very few people have heard of it. The best biography that I think came out on Spurgeon in the 20th century was Arnold Dallamore's introductory biography, maybe 230, 40 pages, something like that. And Arnold Dalmore is better known for his 2 volumes on George Whitefield, which are superb. Lesser known for the Spurgeon biography, but it's a very good biography. And that's I hope people will read my biography and his, because I think that would benefit the student of Spurgeon. But that biography came out in 1984, I think. Um, I chuckle at this. A lot has happened since 1984. I mean, Spurgeon's no less dead than he was then. He's not done anything new. But we've learned a lot more about Spurgeon, in that length of time, those 40 some years. And, like I said, there's been more dissertations written on him in the last 20 years than the last 120. You had, the leading Spurgeon scholars, really only began to write in the 90s, like David Bevington, later, guys like Mark Hopkins and Peter Morden and Christian George and Jeff Chang. So all these discoveries are coming out. We're consulting archives, learning new things about Spurgeon. Some of that's like reflected in Jeff Chang's fantastic book, Spurgeon the Pastor. There'd never been any treatment of his ecclesiology before. We
Mm,
just
right.
only just now are getting that. So we've learned a lot. also you have a major resurgence of interest in Spurgeon. I think there was a lot of interest in Spurgeon in the '80s, but there's far more now. And a lot of that has to do with groups like Together for the Gospel and the Gospel Coalition and the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement, if we could call it that. Seminaries like Southern Seminary and RTS. All these groups have heavy interest in Spurgeon. Spurgeon has kind of been the patron saint of this sort of neo-reformed resurgence. And so there's all kinds of new interest in Spurgeon. So I tried to write the biography in that context with an awareness of that new interest in Spurgeon. And then just beyond that, every generation I think needs a fresh treatment of the man and a new portrait of the figure. And that's something I try to do here. And then given the fact that I studied Spurgeon on the doctoral level, there's a lot of research backing up the biography. So maybe 650 footnotes or something like that for those who want to. I mean, it's written so that the average church member could appreciate and be edified by it. But I try to drop a lot of crumbs for people who want to pursue more academic treatments of Spurgeon. That's a little bit of why I've done what I've done.
Yeah, and I appreciate it going through the book and seeing all those footnotes. And I appreciate the footnotes, not end notes, so you don't have to,
Yeah, yeah.
stick your thumb in
Mhm.
there.
Well, you
Of
can credit my
thinking about
publishers with that. Reformation Heritage seems pretty committed to that, which I appreciate very much.
I good, they're fighting the good fight there.
Amen. Yeah.
Um, and even I've seen, this various footnotes where you're ironing out some dates and things like that,
Mhm,
where there's been a little bit of
mhm.
discrepancy from one biographer to
Yep.
the next, and you've taken the time to try cross reference maybe with a letter of his or something like that
Mhm,
to
mhm,
smooth those things out. So in addition to being very approachable, it's rather short compared to maybe some of the thick ones people might be
mhm,
familiar with, or even his own autobiography that his wife and personal secretary put together after his
mhm,
death.
mhm,
This is something you can throw in your backpack and read for
mhm.
fun on a trip or something like that. And but it does have something new to offer in that it's not only giving you those familiar stories, it's helping maybe correct and add to some of those stories as well.
Yeah, I think trying to provide a hopefully accurate portrait. There have been some errors in previous studies that we now understand with greater clarity. We have better access to things now. Like, for example, the sword and the trowel was very hard to access previously until Midwestern, the Spurgeon Center, digitized the whole thing and put it online for us. So we just have access to things like that we didn't have before. So there
Yeah,
are some inaccuracies that would have been corrected had we had access
right.
to the sword and the trowel. And I should mention the Spurgeon Center is a big part, I think, the Spurgeon Center in Kansas City and Missouri on the campus of Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. That is the major study center for Spurgeon now. They've done so much to shine a light on Spurgeon,
Yep.
all kinds of discoveries they've made. They have now the central archive there, which is huge. Um, and that was only open in 2015. So it seemed that,
Right.
yeah, we were poised. This is really a golden age of Spurgeon studies and Spurgeon publications. I think you see a lot more flying off the press in the next, 20 years on Spurgeon, and I'm really excited to see, what different ones put out there. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I got a conversation coming up with Jeff Chang, curator of the Spurgeon Library, about their new heritage collection.
Mhm,
A lot of Spurgeon stuff coming into
mhm,
the collection there. So we're going to have a conversation about that on a future episode. So stay tuned for that. Now, in the biography, obviously there's some well-worn stories that you're just obligated to tell about
mhm,
Spurgeon's life. Just important elements of his life. They're just great stories that you can't hear too often. How he's converted. He comes on a
mm,
snowy day in the Methodist chapel, and there's a guest preacher, and doesn't exactly give a real wonderful sermon, but it was enough for the Lord to use that to convert Spurgeon. We've got him being kind of tricked into giving his first sermon, things like this that you cover off on there. Um, well, I want to get into some of the other elements that you do cover and talk about is some of those early challenges. He starts to preach remarkably quickly. I'm not sure what it looked like between your conversion and you delivering a sermon. For Spurgeon, it was remarkably short, and he had
mhm,
some challenges right out the gate. I know he was people were wowed by him. He
mhm.
had some really early successes, but it wasn't all smooth sailing. What were some of those challenges that he faced, and how did he ever overcome those?
Well, he begins to preach, we think, around the age of 16 in a lay preachers association in the greater Cambridge area, where Cambridge University is. He was not at the university, but he preached all around Cambridgeshire. And he's an apprentice preacher. He's learning how to preach. He is reading a lot of the best preachers. He's drawing on George Whitefield and Charles Simeon and William Jay and others like that. And he's growing in his preaching. It does appear that from the very beginning, he showed remarkable abilities and remarkable gift in the area of communicating the Word of God and preaching the gospel. So much so that by the time he's 17, he is invited to pastor a local church in a village not far from Cambridge called Waterbeach. He would pastor that church for 18 months, has spectacular success there. I mean, he's a busy pastor there. He's preaching the word, he's shepherding the flock. The congregation grows rapidly from just a few dozen members to about 400, I think. They had people sitting outside with open windows and people coming from all over. And this is not like in a metropolitan area like London. This is in a small rural village.
Right.
And he
Yeah.
sees remarkable fruit in the context of that ministry. And then it's as some are hearing about this boy preacher out there in the Cambridge area that London comes calling, and one of the true historic Baptist churches in London that had formerly been pastored by Benjamin Keach, later John Gill, later John Rippon, uh, just quite a heritage and pedigree there of venerable, kind of Baptist divines. The church called New Park Street Chapel. It had different names in the past, but called New Park Street Chapel at that time. They approach him and ask him to come and preach, and a few months later issue a call for him to come. So he goes to London when he's 19. He's already preached like 600 sermons or so by that time. Had been quite busy preaching throughout the week and on the weekends. And he does know tremendous success. I mean, the church grows rapidly from the very beginning. He becomes something of a metropolitan sensation. People are hearing about him all over London. But you're right, he did experience severe challenges. And one of them would be that some in the religious press of the day were quite critical of him. They felt that he was maybe arrogant. They felt that he was somewhat of a showman. He was quite unique as a preacher, somewhat original, not in his theology or his message, but he was animated. He was warm blooded. He was um, not the quintessential Victorian divine. He would shout. He would appeal. He would plead. He was not afraid to even weep in his preaching. And
Yeah.
people viewed him as vulgar and crass, viewed him as common, and yeah, a little bit arrogant. As who's this young, buck who's coming to London and now filling all these pews? And so we had to deal with a lot of criticism. I actually have a whole chapter on how he dealt with criticism in his early days. I think he dealt successfully with that. Eventually, the criticism sort of subsides after 2 or 3 years as they realize, as he matures, and also as they realize people are being genuinely converted. He is showing maturity. He has staying power, and he would always have critics about his ministry, but for the most part, they subside as you move from the 50s into the 60s. But one of the biggest events that he dealt with was in 1857, 1856, I believe. It was the Surrey Gardens Music Hall disaster, which is a familiar story to fans of Spurgeon, people who know Spurgeon. But he's renting this massive hall to accommodate the big crowds that have come out to hear him, called the Surrey Gardens Music Hall. He gets up to preach, and some miscreants in the crowd, we think to some prank or something, shout fire, fire! The galleries are giving in or whatever, and mass chaos ensues. People run out; they're afraid that the
Yeah.
building is going to collapse and come down, and they actually a number of people are trampled to death. 7 people actually die. One of the stairwells collapses, I think, and there's maybe 28 more injured. It was just a terrible scene, and one that affected Spurgeon for the rest of his life. And of course, his opponents were ready to seize upon that as well.
Right.
Look, this man's ministry has really just been this public spectacle, and now it's actually led to the loss of life, and so that was a very dark episode for Spurgeon that would, I think, give him a kind of psychological limp for the rest of his life. I think there was a genuine modicum of trauma to it all for him that was hard for him to overcome thereafter. But by God's grace, he did navigate it successfully. He did preach again, and of course, the rest is history. So early challenges for sure, and then of course later on, and I have a passage, a chapter on Spurgeon's suffering. He always labored under severe issues of poor health, and that becomes more and more an issue as time goes on. Same with his wife, who struggles as well. Susie was a functional invalid eventually by the 1860s, and so that's a major
Yeah.
part of Spurgeon's story as well.
So he's facing a lot of critics right out the gate,
Hmm.
mostly after he gets to London,
Hmm.
and there's a lot of cruel but humorous, portrayals in terms of like political cartoons of the day,
Oh yeah.
of just comparing the wildly gesticulating young Spurgeon and very unflattering caricatures of him as compared to the composed, regal, ministers of the day. So that was, as you mentioned, a big critique that they had was they viewed that as um, maybe ungodly is too strong, but like unbecoming of a
That's a good way
minister
to
to
put it.
be so common.
Yeah, that they just thought it was unseemly. Here's this youth. I mean, 19, 20, 21, 22, and thousands are going after him to hear him preach, and he preaches with such candor and authority, and he's not really doffing his cap to the traditions of the day, and it's a new kind of preaching for a lot of people,
Yeah,
and he is having a tremendous effect upon and reception among the common man. And he
yeah,
felt, and that was deliberate. He felt that the common man had kind of been forgotten by the religious establishment of the day. He thought the average preaching that people got was stultified and stuffy and was more fit for the university or for the lecture hall. It wasn't really suitable for actually meeting sinners where they were. And so I think anytime you have someone who um, is not deferring to the kind of accepted standard,
yeah.
that's certainly gonna ruffle some feathers, and, so it was easy to peg Spurgeon as a kind of iconoclast in the way that he preached, but again, eventually he kind of wins the city over. I mean, obviously,
Yeah,
immediately he's winning the masses, but his
yeah,
critics eventually soften and
right.
see there's more substance to him than we at first thought. He's not a 9 days wonder. This is a serious, minister, and he's not going anywhere.
Yeah, it's interesting to think as we in our day maybe pick up one of those volumes of Spurgeon sermons and read it like you could forgive someone for saying it's difficult to read this stuffy Victorian, very stiff. Like if they're just straight reading Spurgeon,
Yeah.
imagine then sitting in the pews of the ones he was being compared to and being seen as this wild teenager that is just, I mean, accused of falsely sliding down the banister
Yeah,
of the
yeah, right.
steps to the pulpit and things like that. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it
Well, and
definitely took them by
I
storm.
if I could speak from just a pastoral perspective, I do think that there was something going that God was doing something in that. I think that God was refining Spurgeon. I think that he was being sort of tested and refined in those beginning days. That I think the Lord was showing him from the very beginning, uh, the ministry is not an unbroken boulevard of green lights. It's not, people putting, um, flowers around your neck and crowns on your head and everyone patting you on the back. This is going to be a hard work. And I think that Spurgeon, given how gifted he was and what a massive ministry he had, I think he was in danger of becoming conceited and prideful.
Yeah,
And the Lord was I think gracious in acquainting him with weakness and some measure of opposition from the very beginning. Just think of the way the Lord did that with Paul, that he might not become puffed up with pride, 2 Corinthians 12. There was a thorn in the flesh, and I'm not saying that's exactly what was going on with the criticism there, but I think it softened Spurgeon, and it humbled Spurgeon, and it refined Spurgeon, and so, and it helped to make him more resilient and more resolved in his ministry. So I think I make that suggestion in the book that I think God was doing something there apart from just the social historical ways we can
yeah.
see that coming about. I think that there was good done for Spurgeon through it all, and it prepared him for the larger ministry God called him to.
Absolutely. I think Spurgeon would agree with that. I mean, he referred to pride as his darling sin, that
Mhm,
was
mhm.
that was
Yeah.
the struggle he had. So think of a young man who has thousands upon thousands of people clamoring and pushing to get in to hear him. Probably pretty important to read in the paper next day, like, Spurgeon stinks and he's terrible. Like, you got
Yeah,
to
right, right.
balance that out a little bit. If
Mhm.
everyone's singing his praises, how much more of a challenge would it be?
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Claire. I was just say, and for him to get that adulation and praise and that massive following at like 20 years old,
Right. Yeah.
I think we would immediately be concerned in our own day if a 20-year-old was getting that kind of attention. That could so easily become a snare for a young man like that. It's
Oh yeah.
amazing that Spurgeon was preserved through it all.
Yeah, and which of us, from different ministry, church leadership, pastoral positions, wouldn't be coming to that 20-year-old with severe cautions of watch out, like be
Mhm.
careful, slow down. This is a lot for you
Mhm.
to be experiencing all of this, this great audience growth, if you want to call it that. You're this congregation and people coming to hear you. There's a lot of dangers in that, and no doubt Spurgeon saw that, and God
Mhm.
used these detractors to somewhat counterbalance that. But on the whole, we can look back and say, no, his preaching was wonderful. God did use it mightily. Spurgeon was in fact converted, despite some early questions and critiques. So, what was it about his preaching style that leads him to be known by us as the Prince of Preachers?
Yeah, the book as a whole that I've written is largely a chronological narrative of his ministry. But at one or two points, I stop for kind of topical chapters, and I try to ask that very question in chapter 7 or 8, where I'm asking the question. We don't have recordings of Spurgeon. We have these printed sermons, but surely to hear them preach would be a different matter altogether. What was it that that led him to be called the Prince of Preachers? That provoked this profound response to his preaching that was sustained over 40 years in London. I mean,
Right.
he not only did he attract the crowds, he held them together for that great length of time. Sold something like 100 million sermons by the end of the century, and probably more than that. Many probably forgeries and copies and things like that were made. So I do try to ask and answer that question in the book. There were three things at least that stand out to me that I think contribute in a major way to the appeal of Spurgeon's preaching. The first would be the prominence of Christ and his messages. The person of the Lord Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord is so central to Spurgeon's sermons. And the prominence of the cross, the blood of Christ, um, it's just and then the sort of impassioned invitation for people to come to Jesus, that they might find life. His sermons were just so full of Jesus. And I
Yeah.
think that there was something in Spurgeon himself. I I I think Spurgeon was Christ-centered, not only in that the content of his sermons were Christ-centered, but I think also he adopted something of the disposition of Jesus himself. I think Spurgeon is like Jesus in so many ways. And I think in the way he speaks about sin and grace and faith, I think that many the Lord was pleased to come to people through Spurgeon's sermons and awaken faith and draw them to himself in the most glorious way. So I think the prominence of Christ is huge. His Christ-centeredness. I would say, secondly, Clay, his earnestness in preaching. He has a lecture in his lectures to my students called Earnestness. It's Marring and Maintenance. I think part of the appeal of Spurgeon's sermons, so many hundreds of people, I've read so many accounts of people who heard Spurgeon preach, they identify his earnestness, and by that they meant he was gripped by the truth he was preaching. There was a sense of weight and gravity and eternal moment. He really believed the people in his congregations were either going to heaven or hell, and that where they would go would depend very much how they responded to the message he was preaching. There was just a sense of intensity and earnestness about it. I think people could feel that in the way he carried himself in the pulpit. So you can read his sermons and you can kind of get that from the sermons, but I think there was something in his animation,
Yeah.
the life in his eyes, the inflections of his voice, the sincerity and authenticity with which he pleaded with men. I mean, we have these accounts of him preaching and imploring people to come to Christ, and he's weeping, and his arms are spread wide, and he's essentially appealing and treating that sinners would come to Christ and be saved.
Yeah.
There was an earnestness about his preaching that I think came through that was in many ways unique in that era. And then the third thing I would say is just he preached in a way, I'm going to use the word simplicity. He preached in a simple way, but I don't mean by that as he preached in a silly or lighthearted way. I mean simple in the sense of accessible, relatable, relevant. J.C. Ryle, who was a contemporary Spurgeon's Anglican minister, a very capable preacher himself, wrote the little treatise Simplicity in Preaching, which is just superb. Any preachers listening to this podcast, pick up J.C. Ryle's Simplicity in Preaching. And he actually lists Spurgeon as a leading exemplar of the kind of simplicity he's after. And that is the kind of preaching that meets people where they are, that engages their lives, that shows the relevance of the scriptures to their lives, and directly addresses common people, people who need Christ. He wasn't, he has the famous quip, um, the Lord said, feed my sheep. He didn't say, feed my giraffes. Um, Spurgeon put the cookies on the bottom shelf. I mean, he
Yeah.
just knew how to. And what's amazing about that, though, is that he didn't do that in a way that was crude or vulgar or colloquial or casual. Spurgeon mastered the English language. He could quote long portions of Shakespeare from memory. He read the great poets. He had a full set of Dickens in his library. He had read Virgil and Homer. And so if you read his sermons, he uses quite elevated language, even Shakespearean language at times. But he does it in a way that doesn't leave people behind. He gives context clues. He helps draw people in. So both high and low, he was able to reach in a way that wasn't, hey, let me just use slang and, speak
Yeah.
to the lowest common denominator person in my audience. So God gave him a great gift in that area. But those would be some of the main things: Christ-centeredness, earnestness, his simplicity in preaching, his
Yeah.
mastery of the English language. I could add as well. Those would be things I'd commend in his preaching.
I think so much of it is not a question of, oh, what was it about how he preached that was so successful? Is who he was. You
Yeah,
read some of Spurgeon's letters that he's writing to his mom, his dad, or whoever, and he is just compassionate. He is pointing people to Christ, and these are just, I mean, everyday letters checking in. Hey,
yeah,
thanks for
yeah,
sending me something on my birthday, and like
yeah,
the stuff that he is saying is like so deeply devotional to
yeah.
Christ and trying to draw people's hearts to the Lord
Amen.
in just everyday conversation. And yeah, God's going to use that person mightily.
Yeah,
And I
amen.
think that's important for us to think through is not that Charles Spurgeon walked up there and then flipped a switch and did things a certain way. God
Right.
developed Charles Spurgeon into who he was, and he made him a preacher, and he used him mightily, and he was authentically Spurgeon in the pulpit. That's just who he was.
That's right. He was a man full of tenderness and compassion, a man of integrity, a man who I think really walked with God, a man who was, you know, who he was before the Lord was who he was before the people.
Right.
He knew what it was like to commune with God. He was a man of prayer. And that comes through in his letters, in his sermons, in all kinds of personal reminiscences that people left behind of Spurgeon, and that love and that tenderness that went very far. I mean, I think I share in the book that at one point he writes. There are about 120 students in the pastors' college at this point. He was president of the pastors' college, training men for ministry. He writes a letter to every single child of those men,
Mm.
just warmly commending them to Christ, encouraging them to trust in the Lord. I mean, it's just who he was. He just wanted to do good
Yeah.
wherever he went. And yeah, you're right. It's not like he flicked a switch when he got in the pulpit. He was genuinely himself, the man of God, anointed of God to bless and to minister. And yeah, I think that comes through in his preaching, comes through in other pieces we have from his life.
Yeah. Now, we talked about some of the criticisms that he was experiencing early on. They kind of subside. They never fully go away, and that's not to say that he didn't get involved in different theological and church controversies. Of course, the biggest one being the downgrade controversy, and I think no one can approach or attempt to understand who Spurgeon was and what his life was and his ministry was without understanding a little bit about what the downgrade controversy
Mhm.
was. So, would you be able to give us a succinct explanation of what was the downgrade controversy? Why did it matter and what impact did it have on Spurgeon and his life?
Yeah, that would be one of the areas, Clay, where we've probably learned the most about Spurgeon since, say, Dallamore's biography or the 80s and 90s. So the best book written on that, it's a bit of a long title, but or an unusual title. Nonconformities: Romantic Generation is the name of the study by Mark Hopkins, and he has about 60, 70 pages on downgrade that are really helpful. A lot of original research he did in the archives, and so I'm kind of building on his research in the chapter I do on downgrade. The basic, it's a complex story, but the basic storyline is Spurgeon over the course of the 1980s, or excuse me, not 1980s, 1880s. He dies in 1892. So in the 1880s, he's becoming concerned about liberal drift in the Baptist Union, which is the Baptist denomination he's a part of. And he's becoming more and more concerned about it. He begins to express privately to the leadership of the denomination, hey, we have ministers in the Baptist Union who are teaching false things. And the false things were not like they were teaching, Arminianism or something like that. They were teaching matters that were contrary to basic orthodoxy, things related to the virgin birth, the veracity of miracles, the existence and eternality of hell, questioning the necessity and nature of the atonement, entertaining the idea of universalism, and this has all
Yeah.
been validated in subsequent, research that actually really was beginning to happen in the Baptist Union, and the Baptist Union eventually became thoroughly liberal in the 20th century. But at this time, it was just the beginnings of that. It's the 1880s, so I think German higher criticism beginning to filter down into the divinity schools around that time, and Spurgeon is kind of a whistleblower for it, kind of calling it out first privately. He's being rebuffed. He's not really getting the ear of the denomination. They think he's exaggerating the issues, or they're really not there. And so he begins to make kind of a bit of a public protest. He begins to release articles in the Sword and the Trowel, his monthly magazine, suggesting that this is really a problem, while he continues to make private uh, um, efforts as well to expose this to the leadership. They're just not having it. They think the issue, they're not addressing the issue. They don't think the issue is all that Spurgeon believes it is. And so Spurgeon decides the best thing for him to do is to resign from the Baptist Union. He just thinks he can't in good conscience be part of a denomination that would have some men teaching these things that are actually contrary to basic biblical orthodoxy, and in a denomination where the leadership doesn't see the issue or is not willing to confront the issue. It gets ugly after that because the Baptist Union, so shaken by Spurgeon's resignation, they take a vote of censure against Spurgeon. That is the leadership of the Baptist Union. They vote to censure him as divisive. Here he's made these charges, and he's not really substantiated them. And we think he's acted in an inappropriate way, in a way that is not appropriate. And well, it gets really ugly after that because then it becomes kind of lines are drawn, and Spurgeon you know is out of the denomination now, and yet there are men in the denomination who are supporters of Spurgeon, and some of whom are not, and they're kind of fighting it out, and they keep kind of dragging Spurgeon back into it, and it would really define. It was like the defining chapter of the last 5, 6, 7 years of his life, and his wife suggests that it contributed to his premature death at 57.
Yeah.
He was so discouraged by it all, and a lot of the men he had trained, follow him and support him. But some don't. Some think, well, yes, he's overstated the problem. He's exaggerated the problem. He's kind of lost his way a bit, and that, of course, broke his heart. And well, Spurgeon says at some point in the controversy that he's content to be eaten of dogs for 50 years. Um, but he suggests, the more distant future will vindicate me. By
Yeah.
that, I think Spurgeon meant the last day will vindicate him. But of course, it was much sooner, I think, that he was vindicated as actually really having his finger on the pulse and identifying the enemies at the gate. And there was clear error that was being propounded in the Baptist
Yeah.
Union that began to be manifest even just within a generation. Um, and so I think he was largely right in that stand. I think it was difficult though. It's a very complex story, but that's a bit of the outline of the downgrade controversy.
No, it's a helpful overview, and again, it's an important element of Spurgeon's biography. So as people read them, they're going to encounter that no matter what biography they pick up on, and I think it's a really helpful insight into who Spurgeon was. Yes, he was compassionate and he was tender-hearted, but he was valiant for the truth, and he was drawn to that character from Pilgrim's Progress about being valiant and courageous and standing up and standing firm, and he was that. But as you say, on top of his physical ailments, this really took a lot out of Spurgeon, and it wasn't too long after all of this kind of the dust settles that he does have a relatively early death. He dies in 1892, I believe is correct, as you mentioned. And here we are over 130 years later, and we're talking about Charles Spurgeon. And there's another biography coming out, and there's more research coming out, and there's lots of great things happening at Midwestern regarding Spurgeon. And I've got this podcast now on Spurgeon. Why is that? What is the enduring element of Spurgeon's legacy?
Wow. Yeah, I would propose a few reasons why I think he continues to be so relevant and the subject of so much popular interest. Again, I go back to his Christ-centeredness. I think it's before the phrase gospel-centered was being used a lot. Spurgeon was genuinely gospel-centered, and so those who love the gospel appreciate that the gospel shapes the Christian life. That it's not just like how we get saved, but rather shapes the whole Christian life and experience. I think they get so much of that in Spurgeon, so much of Jesus in Spurgeon. And so I don't know how you, Clay, would assess that the quote unquote gospel centered movement or the Young Restless and Reform movement. I do think at its best, its recovery of the centrality of the gospel is a good and healthy thing, and that was so much what Spurgeon was about. I wrote an article once somewhere online called Spurgeon Together for the Gospel Before T4G or something like that. And the point I was trying to get across is just how he understood. Yes, Calvinism's important. Yes, Baptist convictions are important, but the gospel above all, the gospel as central, the gospel is shaping and informing everything else. I think is so important. I think people see that in Spurgeon. I think he's relevant also because of how open he is about his own failings and his own weaknesses. Spurgeon was transparent about his struggles with depression and anxiety. And he's very transparent in ways that are uncharacteristic, I think, of a lot of Victorians. We think of the Victorian as kind of the all put together, the veneer of gentility and respectability. Spurgeon is in the pulpit saying, I doubted this week whether or not I was a child of God. And that kind of sincerity and authenticity, I think, appeals to the current generation and showing the ways in which Christ is the solution, whether it's with matters of assurance or struggling with fear and doubt and despair, suffering in an ongoing way. He had chronic suffering, and I think a lot of people have been drawn in for that reason. People who deal with chronic health issues. His wife dealt with chronic health issues. So there are things in his experience that make him, I think, attractive to people. And then it just is true factually that there is a recovery of interest in Spurgeon's theology. There is a recovery of interest in the doctrines of grace, in the 1689 Confession, in big God theology. And Spurgeon represents one who was a massive, robust, muscular articulator of that theology that was so shot through with grace and compassion and tenderness and winsomeness that you can't help but love the guy. And so, and also, he's not really been canceled. Some theologians now, it's harder to be as, Martin Luther, you got to deal with some anti-Semitism there, and Jonathan Edwards on slaves, and George Whitefield with his, his orphanage and all that. And so you always have to kind of apologize for. With Spurgeon, there's kind of not much of that. He has worn well over the years, and I'm not dismissing that there's other great men of the faith who were imperfect, and but Spurgeon was also imperfect. But people are not having to deal much with those kinds of issues when it comes to Spurgeon. So he's worn well historically. Those are just some reasons why I think. But I think it really is his sermons and his preaching, as full of Christ as they are. They're attractive to needy sinners who are looking for the grace of God, looking to find Christ. They find him in the ministry of Charles Spurgeon.
Amen. Well, there's obviously lots more that can be said about Charles Spurgeon. That's why folks like you and myself talk about Charles Spurgeon a lot. I encourage people to pick up a copy of the book, Spurgeon, A Life, a biography of the Prince of Preachers. Our guest has been Alex DiPrima. Pastor Alex, thanks so much for joining me to have this conversation about Charles Spurgeon.
Clay, it's been a privilege. Thank you, brother.
Thanks for joining me for the Spurgeon Legacy podcast. Now, I encourage you to pick up a copy of Spurgeon, A Life by Alex DiPrima. I think you'll get a lot out of it. And if you enjoyed this conversation, I encourage you to subscribe so you don't miss what we have coming up next. Be sure to share this episode with a friend who appreciates Charles Spurgeon and you think would get something out of it. So thanks for joining me on the Spurgeon Legacy podcast. We'll see you next time.